Well, happy Sunday, friends. Let me stop this music in the background. Hey, guys, how are you guys doing? We have made it through another week. It is Memorial Day weekend, so many of you have a long, extended weekend. And so I wanted to keep my word and come back with a part three as we finish up Mental Health Awareness Month and continuing our discussion on the soul. So I will wait just a couple of more seconds to see who all joins. But as always, you can go back and watch the replay. If you do catch this on the replay, please type replay in the comments so that I can know that you are watching or that you had an opportunity to watch. I also enjoy feedback if this conversation is one that was helpful. If there are more conversations that you would like to have, not necessarily about the soul, but anything related to mental health, just things that may come up you have questions about, let me know. I definitely do not mind having another talk outside of Mental Health Awareness Month. But my goal this month was just to try to be consistent and teach each Sunday. Talking about the soul was our focus. So I am not going to belabor the time. I know that many of you are probably with family, you may be with friends, some of you are still indulging in that after church nap. All of that is all good. And I came on a little bit earlier just so I can get somewhere and sit my hips down too. Your girl is tired. And so, like I said, I just wanted to make sure that I hop on today so that we can close out our discussion on the soul. As you come in, please say hello. Let me know you are watching. I do have the comments pulled up as always. And so, as I go through this teaching, if there is something that you would like for me to repeat, if there is something that you would like for me to explain a little more, please do not hesitate to ask me to repeat, explain, or if you have a comment or a question about something else, I am watching the chat. So please let me know, as we go through this, if I need to do any or all of the above. So today we are going to be talking about grief. And typically, when people hear grief, they automatically consider situations where a person has passed away. That's typically where a lot of focus and a lot of attention is put as it relates to grief. But grief is so much more than just the death of a person. It definitely includes that, but I think that we get in this mindset that grief is something that is only related to the passing of an individual. And so then when we go through life and we have these moments and experiences that feel like grief, we may not even be aware that we are in fact grieving a situation simply because we've only ascribed grief to death. And so my goal tonight is to exprod. What a word. I was trying to say expand and broaden at the same time. So we just gonna make a new word, exprodding. We're going to expand and broaden our definitions and our understanding of grief. So we are going to get right into this. All right. So many years ago, Dr. Hart Ramsey, I can't remember what we were talking about in the service. It must have been about grief. But he made this comment and it has stuck with me throughout all of these years. He said that grief is the heart's response of finding the easiest way to let go. Grief, simplest definition, is the heart's response of trying to find the easiest way to let go. And so, like I said, every time I use it, I have to give him credit. I use it so much that I owe him royalties and I'm going to pay up on them because I'm good for it. But he has done such a phenomenal job of being able to provide language to a lot of different experiences, especially when it comes to the things that are occurring in our soul. So, grief is the heart's response of trying to find the easiest way to let go. So, when we look at just a broader definition of grief, it is the natural emotional response to loss, of course, like we discussed, particularly the death of a loved one, but also to other significant changes or endings, right? Such as jobs or relationships or dreams. It encompasses a range of intense and often painful emotions, including sadness, anger, guilt, and despair. And we're going to go through and break down all of those. Grief affects individuals physically, emotionally, mentally, and also spiritually. And the experience and expression of grief can vary widely from person to person. It is a complex process. So that means there is no one shoe that fits everybody when it comes to grief. It is not a one size fits all. And when it comes to grief, because it affects so many parts of us, it affects us mentally, it affects us emotionally, it affects us spiritually, it can affect us physically. Each one of those components may require something different as you begin to address grief. So that's what makes it so complex. Okay. And the experience and expression of grief can vary widely from person to person. And we talked about it being complex. That involves mourning the loss, coming to terms with the reality of the change, and gradually finding ways to move forward while at the same time maintaining a connection to what was lost. Grief is multifaceted, which means there are many different faces to it. And then, like we talked about, it encompasses emotional, cognitive, also social and spiritual dimensions. So, one thing that we can all agree on when it comes to grief is that grief is universal. What that means is no matter where you are, no matter where you come from, we all have experienced or will experience grief. It does not matter whether you live in Africa. It does not matter if you live in Canada. It does not matter what religion you identify with. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. None of those matter when it comes to grief. It is universal. We all, at some point in our lives, will experience grief in one form or another, whether that grief is related to the death of an individual or that grief may be related to a situation, a circumstance, an identity. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about those other types of grief that we don't normally talk about or consider. So grief is universal, touching every culture and every society. The only thing that I think would be true and that would be different across cultures is how people express their grief. I know in certain countries, when someone passes away, it can be a very celebratory type of situation where they really celebrate, they honor the person that passed away. Then in other cultures, it may be very somber, it can be very emotional. So depending on the culture, how they celebrate grief or how they acknowledge grief may be different. But we are not able to escape grief in any capacity. So it's also important to understand the overall effects of grief on the soul. Understanding how grief affects the soul helps in processing and healing from the loss. It provides insight into personal experiences and equips us to support others through their own grief journey. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of the soul. And if you've been listening to any of my previous teachings, I've talked a lot about the soul, understanding the soul. And the soul is the mind, it's the will, it's the emotion, it's the intellect, and the soul also contains your memories. So let's look at it from a philosophical perspective. So some ancient philosophers had their ideologies about grief. Plato said that the soul is the immortal essence of a person, the true self that survives beyond physical death. So Plato feels that once a person dies, in his perspective, the soul lives on. And so you see that too, again, in certain cultures that believe that the soul continues to live on after a person dies, or that the spirit may continue to live on when a person departs the earth. Aristotle believed that the soul is the form and essence of a living being, intricately linked with the body. The soul is the form and essence of a living being, intricately linked with the body. So now let's look at that from a religious standpoint, looking at Christianity. We know that the soul is eternal and created by God, right? Grief affects one's spiritual journey and their relationship with God. So, how does that happen? And so, let's talk about how grief, in a lot of instances, can affect a person's relationship with God. Depending on where a person is and how they view God, when grief happens, it can be easy. You see this a lot when somebody passes away, where someone passes away and now their relationship with God is affected, especially if they're angry about that person passing away, or if they feel that God didn't honor their prayer. If the individual was sick and then they've been praying for them to get healed, and they were believing that God was going to heal them on this side of the earth, but God may have chose to heal them a different way. And so when we are in the middle of our grief, it can be difficult to see that in God's goodness and God's mercy that he did heal them, but he healed them in heaven. And we don't always know too the prayers of that individual. And so if I've been praying for my loved one to get healed, and I now feel that God did not honor my prayer, or God did not listen to what I've asked him to do, then that can cause me to have a discontentment in my relationship with him. But it can also cause me to create distance between myself and God, because I'm angry that you didn't honor my prayer. I'm mad that you took them from me, right? And so people sometimes, when they go through grief, and we'll talk about the different stages, but typically one of the initial stages is anger. They can be angry at God for whatever reason. But then sometimes too, once they're able to settle in the grief and they're able to now have a different perspective about the reality of what happened, they may be able to now mend that relationship with God because their perspective has been changed. Another way that grief can create distance or alter the relationship with God, it may not even be related to death. As I said before, grief is not just about death. And that is why so many times people grieve, but they don't even know that they're grieving, because we're typically taught that grief is only associated with death. So you're grieving a loss, but not realizing that what you are actually experiencing is actually the stages of grief. And so maybe you were believing God for a situation, right? But in that situation, loss came out of it. One realistic example of where somebody may grieve a situation is like maybe you were believing God to open a certain door for you. Like you knew that was the door, you were believing God for it, but for whatever reason, that door didn't open. And so now people will begin to grieve the possibility. It's not even that situation happened, but we are the type of individuals that when we formulate in our mind that we want something, we've already seen it play out. Like we've seen ourselves walking through the door. We've seen how this opportunity can change the trajectory of our life. Like we've calculated, we are very, we look foresight, like we're trying to look ahead. And so we've already seen how this thing that we're believing for fits into our life. But when it doesn't happen, it creates grief. And I'm now dealing with the loss of an expectation, because you can not only grieve something that happened, it is also possible to grieve something that never even happened. Does that make sense? You can grieve something that never even happened because you've connected your soul to it. You've connected your faith to it. You've connected your entire being into whatever it is that you're now believing for. And again, when it doesn't happen, it creates loss and it triggers grief. And so it is very important to know where you are as it relates to different circumstances and situations and not dismiss certain feelings that come up. Because, like I said, many times we've all walked through loss in some capacity. We've all experienced grief in some capacity that had nothing to do with death. But because we didn't know what it was, we dismissed it. But then it can be difficult for us to finally move forward into whatever the next thing is in life, whatever the next season is, because we're still circling that mountain of grief because we have not been able to let go of our own expectations. And that can be difficult too when you're trying to trust God, when you're learning how to trust God, because we have our own expectations when it comes to God. We have our own expectations. He may not come when you want him, but what, saints? He's an on-time God. Like, he's going to come. But because of our expectations, we oftentimes limit God. And when we limit God, we only disappoint ourselves because we're expecting things to go a certain way. And it can't be that way as you grow in your relationship with God. So next, let's look at some modern psychological views on the soul or the psyche as it relates to grief and loss. So when I say grief, keep in mind that we're not just talking about death, but we're looking at loss altogether, right? So psychology often uses the term psyche to refer to the mind, the emotions, and personality. The psyche encompasses the conscious and unconscious processes, and they are both deeply affected by grief. So modern psychology says that your psyche is your conscious, which means those are the things that you are aware of, but also your unconscious, those things that are happening in the background of your mind that you may not necessarily have a situational awareness to, right? But they are both affected by grief. So how does that look? You have things that you are experiencing that affects your conscious, like you are aware that there is a grief that's taking place. You are aware that there is a loss, but unconsciously, there are other things that we walk through and we experience that we don't even realize in that moment there is now a loss. Part of my heart has been broken. A part of my soul may also have been fragmented by something that I walk through. And the reason why we may not be fully aware in that moment that there is something going on unconsciously is because of how the brain works. The brain is wonderful at protecting itself. The brain is wonderful at making sure that you don't lose your mind. But when the brain goes into this protective mode, it's almost like when your computer goes to sleep. Like, you still can use it, everything, the programs are still running. But when you're using your laptop after so many minutes of inactivity, it goes to sleep. But you wiggle the mouse, you wiggle the keyboard, or you open it up and boom, it's like nothing ever happened. Well, that is somewhat what the brain does when you are going through something that we'll consider traumatic. You're going through something, and the mind does not have the ability to allow you to fully experience what you're dealing with at that moment. So it kind of goes to sleep, and that looks more like your unconscious. So you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, but you fear no evil. So you have no situational awareness to what is going on in that moment. But then when the dust settles and the brain is no longer in sleep mode and is activated, it's not even that you realize consciously that there is something that has happened, but you usually feel it here. You usually are feeling low. Maybe there's a sadness that you can't quite put your finger on. So you typically know that there is something playing in the background, typically by how you feel. Like, I just got this thing, I just can't shake it. But you can't identify what it is that is underneath the surface that is now triggering these heavy emotions, right? Because unconsciously something happened. And then usually it's later on, either you sit with the therapist or you talk to a friend, and then you realize, oh man, I know why I've been feeling sad lately. I'm gonna tell you how what it I'll give you an example of how that plays out unconsciously. So here's a really good example. Many times people deal with cycles of emotions. It's cyclic, which typically means that at a certain time of year, certain feelings may come up. Um, Sometimes it can be a certain part of the day, but we'll use at something that happens every year. And it's been really good for me to be able to help people that are dealing with the grief of an individual, that they be able to recognize those seasons of cycles. And so what that looks like is, let's say you had somebody that passed away. We'll use death as an example here. And let's say they passed away in July, right? Well, maybe it's been 5 years and you feel like you're at a place, you're healed, you've processed your grief, but you didn't even realize that starting at the end of June, it's like the cloud came in. Like the cloud came in, the sun doesn't seem as bright, the sky's not as blue. You're not really depressed, but you don't feel like yourself. Like maybe there's a little bit of heaviness that is starting to sink in at the end of June. But you just think maybe it's hormonal, maybe you think that you've just been working too much. Like in that moment, you're not consciously connecting the dots, right? But it begins with a feeling. So then July rolls around and you just cannot get it together. You driving and crying to work and you like, oh my God, what is wrong with me? Like you just have no situational awareness to what could be contributing to these heavy emotions that literally has you feel like you're going cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? But then it hits you. Oh man, July is the month that so and so passed away. Then it makes sense. But that's what it looks like when unconsciously you're grieving something, but you have no conscious awareness of it, no conscientious of it. You're not aware of what's going on until you connect the dots. And that too is why sometimes grief can be tricky. Grief sometimes can even be dangerous because of how delayed it can be. And then, like I said, we'll go through and talk about the stages of grief and sometimes what happens during that initial shock. And I'll do a little bit more explaining of what's going on in the brain so it makes sense for you. So there's also a connection between the soul and emotional well-being. And we talked about again that the soul is your mind, your will, your emotions, your intellect, and your memories. And so talking about memories, those memories can be good because they can allow you to always have the memories of that person. But sometimes memories can make it difficult for you to be able to move forward. So if you have good memories of an individual, that usually gives you peace, that gives you healing, or even if you have good memories of a situation, like maybe a previous season of your life, you may say, man, I had, that was a good season. Like you had really good memories. So having those good memories can provide closure, but they can also give you what you need to be able to move forward. It can be more difficult to be able to walk through grief and loss if you don't have pleasant memories. So those memories now become haunting. Those memories can even be daunting. Those memories can cause you to stay kind of stuck in the past, because then you begin to ruminate about all of the unpleasantness, and whatever those dark memories are, they serve as a prison to keep you now bound to the heavy emotions. It acts as a catalyst that feeds the fire of the depression. It feeds the fire of the dark cloud that comes in and doesn't leave. So memories can be good on one hand, but memories on the other hand can be very demonic and triggering in nature. So it is a balance of knowing the difference. Sometimes we hold on to those memories again for fear that if I no longer have these memories, then I'm not going to remember the person, or I'm not going to be able to connect to whatever that situation was. And so you have to know, are these memories serving you? And it's not necessarily completely possible to do like Men in Black, where you hit the flashlight little thingy and you just completely erase the memories. But I think that there is the ability to somewhat stop the memories, stop the rumination, and putting those memories in a part of your mind that you don't go back to and open. Like, you do have the ability to not allow those memories to continue to come to the surface. Because, like I said, a lot of that is demonic in nature anyway. So once you deal with the spiritual component that may be driving those dark memories, then 9 times out of 10, the memories go away because you've dealt with the source of them. All right, so now let's get into the stages of grief. So Kubler-Ross is a well-known individual who has identified the stages of grief. We use it a lot in psychology. But one thing about the stages of grief, they are in no particular order. The stages of grief can come literally in any order. And you can kind of go back and forth between various stages. And so let's look at the stages of grief, discuss how they affect us and what they look like. So typically, and again, when we say grief, think about bigger than just death. This could be a job. This can be a situation. This could be a circumstance. This could be an opportunity. This could be a season. This could be an identity. And so grief. So typically the first stage is denial, initial disbelief and shock. So when a person is in denial, again, you have to consider what is going on in the brain. The brain can only handle so much before it short circuits or before it is like overloaded and it'll completely shut down. And what that looks like when the brain has shut down or is overloaded, people will have a mental break, like they will have a nervous breakdown because the mind cannot handle what is going on in that moment. So that'll give you a little bit of context of what that looks like. So denial is the initial disbelief and shock. It is the mind's way of protecting itself from the full impact of the loss. The brain is protecting itself. It's like this self-preservation. I am going to protect me because I can't handle this right now. So it is complete denial and complete shock. And I've seen individuals, especially as it relates to someone passing away, this phase can last for days, that they're just in complete denial and complete shock. I've seen people that the grief can be so overwhelming as it relates to death that they just go mute. Like you've probably seen people like this too, where it's like the lights are on, but honey, there ain't nobody at home. But then when they come to their faculties and they come to their senses, it's like you're Groundhog's Day. It's like you're telling them what happened all over again. It can be the same when you look at, here's a good example. So Diary of a Mad Black Woman, Helen. So Helen, in my mind, was there when her husband, I just forgot his name, but he told her that she had to get out, right? And so the driver, the mover guy came and, showed up and he was like, hey, I'm here to pick up Helen. I was told to pack up your stuff and take you somewhere. She was in complete denial. Like she was in complete, she was like, I ain't going nowhere. Like this my house. Like despite all of these new clothes being brought in, she was in complete denial. Because how does this happen, right? It's that initial shock that the brain goes into to try and preserve itself so that you don't completely lose your mind. And so again, you see this denial and shock when it happens, maybe unexpectedly. You also see this acted out when people, like, I'll use Snap for an example. Snapped is a little bit more extreme. So that's a show that comes on, I think, Crime TV. And it usually involves these individuals who they catch their partner, their spouse, significant other doing stuff they ain't got no business. And they like snap, like they kill them or they beat them within an inch of their life. Like they go ham. Well, that can be the same too. They're in shock. And so when you're in that state of shock, there is limited control of what happens because again, the brain is trying to protect itself. So if it shuts down one part of the brain, then whatever part is active is typically when it comes to impulses, because that has to deal more with our frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe deals with our anger, it deals with impulses. So if I'm shutting down the brain that deals more with logic and reason, then the part that is active now deals with impulses. So it is alive and well. And so because the part of my brain that deals with logic and reason is no longer active, I don't have the logical capacity to say this probably ain't a good idea, or be able to reason within myself to make sense of the situation. So again, when a person is dealing with denial and shock, the logic and region part of the brain, I believe it's called the amygdala, shuts down. The frontal lobe that deals with which is also including the right brain that deals with emotion, all of that part is active. And so that's what you're going to do. You're going to respond out of emotion. So that's what denial and shock can look like. So the next stage typically can be anger. Frustration and helplessness manifest as anger towards self, anger towards others, anger towards the situation, and I'll even include anger towards God. And we talked about that briefly in the beginning. So after I'm out of denial, like I've come to the reality, I am conscious of what is going on in this moment. Now I'm mad, right? And again, that anger can be, maybe if it's directed towards self, people can be angry if it's related to the death of an individual. I should have went and saw them while they were sick. Or they can be angry because maybe their last conversations didn't go well. That's why it is so important to not allow tension in relationships. And I'm not saying that you have to be friends with an individual. I'm not saying that you have to do any of those things. But what I am saying is we never know when a person may depart. And if you know that there's animosity, there's ill will, if you have the ability, now there are certain circumstances and situations that you have to pray and give that to God, right? But if you have the ability to offer an apology, to offer forgiveness, to offer an amends with a person, that makes it so that in the event that something happens, you're not grappling with the anger and the frustration of that. And then sometimes when people are dealing with that anger because of the circumstances and the condition of that relationship, it can prolong their grief, or it can make that grief so much more intense. I see it a lot in therapy when people come in for grief counseling. And I typically already know that when they are angry, it's typically that they're angry at themselves because they have a list of shoulda, woulda, couldas. I should have did this. I could have did this. What if I would have done that? And so there is no ability to now apologize or make amends with that individual. And so the grief it really hits them so much harder because of the regret that they have. Being angry is typically attached to some form of regret, right? And so, like I said, it's important that if you have the ability to make amends, the Bible says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. And so, being able to, even if that means you make peace within your own self, but that you also make peace with God. Sometimes that can be very healing. It can be therapeutic. Again, if it's not in your best interest, because you got to exercise wisdom with some of this stuff. So it may not be in your best interest to reach out to them and say, hey, can we talk? Or try to rectify, those situations. Or they may be angry at the individual. Again, I can see that a lot when an individual, if they did something that maybe contributed to their own death, like for example, somebody, maybe they drank too much and then it resulted in a fatal car accident. They can be angry with that individual because of the decisions that they made, created a situation that caused their life to end early, right? So they may have anger towards the individual. But then too, sometimes if we're looking at situations, people can be angry at a situation. Again, if God is asking you to do something, but he's also requiring you to let something go, then you may be mad at the situation. I'll give you a realistic example because, I'm all about telling y'all about my life, right? Because I always tell you guys the stuff that I teach is because I don't walk through this stuff. Like, I didn't get this out of no book. Like, I am a living testimony. So many of you know that when Kai turned 16, that's my youngest, he wanted to go and live with his father. Baby, I was 38. Do they still say 38? I was 38. I was hot. And I was so mad, not at him, but I was mad at the situation because I was like, nah, I'm your mama. You can't go. But then Holy Spirit was like, okay, get what why can't he go live with his dad? Give me one reason. I ain't have one. I had reasons, but I didn't have a good legitimate reason, right? So I was angry at the situation. I was also angry at God for requiring me to make this decision. I felt like God was punishing me by asking me to let my child go live with his father. I felt like God was being, showing favoritism between me and his dad. I was angry at the situation because I didn't want him to go live with his father because that's my baby. Like I love my boys. And so I had to deal with the grief of that because my initial phase wasn't denial because I was very aware of what was going on. My initial phase of grief related to that loss because him going to live with his father was still a loss. And again, these are circumstances that we don't talk about, but it was a loss for me. I was angry. I was so angry, but I had to process that. And I had to be honest with myself that I was angry. And I had to be honest with God. God, I am PO'd about this situation, right? But I'm thankful that I've always obeyed God despite how I feel. I've always tried to align myself with God's perfect will for my life, even if it didn't feel good. A lot of the choices that I've had to make in life wasn't because Holly wanted to do them. A lot of things that I've done over the years that were very tough and very difficult decisions were because they aligned me in God's perfect will. And I'll say this to someone who may be struggling with letting go as it relates to a situation. God, in his sovereignty, has already counted up the cost of what that is going to cost you to let go. But what we don't always know is what God's purpose is in asking us to let go. God will never require us to let go of something without ensuring that not only will he make it up, because God will never be in debt to us. This is not only related to your money. God will never be in a position that he now owes us. And when I tell you that I know for a fact, because I've walked through it more than once. Every time God has required me to let go of something, he has always blown my mind. He's always shown me the exceedingly abundantly above all that I can ever ask or think. Now, that does not mean that the grief of it subsided. Oh, absolutely not. I cried many days and nights because my child was not at home. But I saw the fruits of my sacrifice on the back end of it, right? And so that's why sometimes when God is asking us to let go, it can be so hard. I think about the picture that sometimes you see floating around of the little girl and Jesus, and she has like a little teddy bear. And Jesus is asking her for the teddy bear, and she like doesn't want to give it to him. But what she does not know is that behind his back, he has a huge teddy bear. But the only way that she is able to receive more is that she has to be willing to let go of what she has and what she finds her prized possession. So that's why it can be difficult. So sometimes we experience anger. Next, you have bargaining, which is attempting to negotiate a way out of the pain, often through promises or hypothetical scenarios. This is sometimes you will see this like, God, if you'll just, if you do this and I'll do that. You sometimes see bargaining when it comes to a person before they've actually passed away. You see this a lot, when someone is sick, or maybe they've been given a certain amount of time to live. You'll have individuals trying to get their own selves right with God. God, I promise I'll do right by you if you just heal them. God, I promise that I won't do X, Y, and Z if you do X, Y, and Z. You can also see bargaining with individuals. You can see that a lot when it comes to relationships that are being severed, especially more so like maybe a romantic relationship. And like maybe one individual is like, you know what, I am done. I'm not going to be in this relationship anymore. Well, the person that wants to be in the relationship may say, well, if you stay, I promise I'll stop drinking. Or if you stay, I promise I'll stop doing whatever. So someone is trying to give something in exchange for getting something. That's what bargaining looks like. Next, and this is the one that typically people go back and forth between, is depression. Depression is deep sadness, withdrawal, and a sense of hopelessness as the reality of the loss sets in. With depression, I find in my work and in my practice that people find themselves depressed like once the dust is settled, when it comes to death, especially. You don't typically see the depression when people are right in the middle of dealing with that initial phase of grief. Like they've gone through the denial, they're angry, maybe there was some bargaining, but because when someone passes away, typically there's a lot of busyness. People are constantly calling and checking. So they have that support. And so that can be a good buffer so that they're not really feeling it. But it's typically when the phone calls slow down, when the visits stop, when everybody has returned to normal. And now you're kind of left to deal with your own thoughts, and you're left to deal with everything that has transpired. And you've actually had an ability now to be aware of what has happened. That's typically when depression sets in. And so it's important for you, if you are someone who knows that someone close to you, they've experienced a death, it's good to be around when it initially happens, but people they need you the most when the dust settles. That's when they need you to check on them. That's when they need you to ask, how are you doing? What's going on? And again, that time frame is typically where it's very critical and important to get connected to someone with grief therapy. because that's when those emotions are the rawest. And that's when you have an ability to now verbalize where you are in the process. Because again, on the front end, because so much is going on, your emotions are somewhat numb, you may not be aware. Denial and also anger sometimes acts like an anesthetic, where because those two can be so big, especially with anger, you may not actually be able to feel the sadness and everything else, the hopelessness, because the emotions are somewhat numb. Like you may not feel anything. But true, just as if when pain medicine wears off, when it wears off, when it hits you, that pain can be very intense and it can be very overwhelming. Next, which is typically the last phase, is acceptance. Coming to terms with whatever the loss is. Like, I fully accepted that this is where I am. I fully accepted that what has happened has happened. I like to use that when a person has reached acceptance, they've come to terms with peace. They've made peace with the situation. You know, when you've reached the stage of acceptance, when you have peace about it. That does not mean that you still don't hurt. That does not mean that there may be moments where you feel depressed. That doesn't mean any of that. Acceptance means that you've come to a place where you now have peace. When it comes to grief, like I said, grief is not this. Grief is not you go through a straight line and you check off the boxes of the emotions. Once people come out of denial, it's rare that they go back to denial, but sometimes they can. But typically people go back and forth between anger and depression. Anger and depression. That is where people typically get stuck. They'll be mad, then they'll be depressed. They'll be depressed, then they'll be mad. Like that's typically the two that people have the hardest time moving out of. But like I said, even once they move out of it, they find themselves still kind of teeter-tottering between the two of them. So there is another model for grief that you may not have heard of, and it's called Worden's Four Tasks of Mourning. So these are four things that you need to do in order to grieve. And it's similar to Kubler-Ross, but the order is a little bit different, and these are more practical. These are giving you steps as far as what you need to do. Number one is accepting the reality of the loss. So in Worden's Four Tasks of Mourning, acceptance is the first stage, whereas in Kubler-Ross, acceptance is the last stage, right? So this would be a good place to begin once you've gone through the stages of grief. So you just accepted that there is a loss. So now you have to accept the reality of the loss. Next, processing the pain of the grief. Processing the pain of the loss. And this takes time. Time does not heal all wounds. And there is no clock that anyone can set that they say, you know what, in 30 days, you're going to be done grieving. In 6 months, the pain is not going to hurt anymore. There are people who have accepted the loss. They've made peace with it. But if they think about it long enough and hard enough, there are still moments that when they consider the loss, that it still creates a sense of pain. That does not mean that they haven't healed from it. But again, those memories may still be there. And when we love, when we connect our soul to individuals, our soul then becomes fragmented in those pieces, and it may always be tender, right? Next, adjusting to a world without the person, if it's someone that's deceased, or adjusting to the world without whatever you lost, right? Adjusting to the world without whatever it is that you lost. 4, finding an enduring connection while embarking on a new life. Finding an enduring connection while embarking on a new life. So there are also different variables in individuals as they experience grief. Individual experience of grief are highly variable. And what that means is no one experience is the same. And I think it's important that we not become somewhat textbook or we copycat how we treat people when it comes to grief. What one individual needs as they are grieving and dealing with loss may not necessarily be true for somebody else. So the best thing to do is to check in with the individual and ask them, how can I support you during this? How can I be of support to you as you experience this new change in your life, as you experience this loss? What do you need from me? Because again, we may think that an individual needs a certain thing, and that may not actually be what they need. It's the same when you think about the 5 love languages. The way that a person gives love may not necessarily be the same way that they receive love. It's the same when someone is dealing with hurt, when they have pain in their heart. What you need to feel comfort when your heart is hurting and when your soul is heavy may not necessarily be what another individual needs. And so again, it's always just best practice just to check in with them and just simply ask them, what do they need or how you might be able to support them. There's factors that influences grief. Again, personality, checking in with what they need, cultural background. How does their family deal with loss? If it's a death, how does their culture deal with dying in the death process? The relationship to the deceased, what a distant cousin may need as it relates to a death is not going to be the same as a spouse or a child or the person that may be deceased. And then also too, the relationship to the loss, how that particular loss has impacted that individual, or where are they in relation to the loss may determine what they need. And then of course the circumstances that are surrounding the loss, because again, certain situations, certain circumstances may be more difficult to process. And so if they are more difficult and more challenging, it may require something different. So the emotional and psychological effects of grief on the soul. So we know that there are short-term effects, like we talked about initially, shock and numbness. And again, that's the immediate reaction to loss, which is characterized by a sense of belief and that emotional numbness. Then you may have intense sadness and crying. You typically see that on the front end of it. But again, as a person goes through that grieving process, you may see that intense sadness and crying be like in ebbs and flows, like it comes and it goes. So there's overwhelming sorrow, frequent tears, and feelings of deep emotional pain. We talked a little bit about anger and frustration, feelings of anger directed at oneself, others, again, or the circumstances surrounding the loss. So now let's look at more long-term effects. So there could be persistent sadness or depression. So like maybe it's been more than 6 months, it's been more than a year, and you are still very much dealing with intense sadness and crying. One thing that I did not know is that grief in itself, which should be a process that if we had to estimate, maybe within a year you've come to a place of peace. And again, not necessarily putting a time frame on it, but if we had to quantify it, then we would look at it like that. But if it's been you're in year 2, year 3, and you're still dealing with these big heavy emotions, it could be that the grief has now become a spirit of grief, because the enemy will use anything to find an open door. And so grief is one of those doors that the enemy will use to gain access. When people are dealing with grief and loss, they will find themselves in situations and circumstances that compromise their character, that compromise their identity, that compromise the full essence of who they are in an effort to stop the pain, right? And we've all been there when we are hurting, maybe due to a loss, or maybe we're grieving. We will find ourselves in circumstances and situations that don't align with who we are because of the pain. Well, now that's an open door, right? The enemy will use that. Or we make decisions that are not good for us because of the pain and what we are experiencing. And so when it becomes to the fact that this grief is now prolonged, you may not only need the inner healing piece, which deals with the soul, but it may be that because these demonic doors have now been opened, it may also be that you have to go through deliverance because the spirit of grief has now taken on you, almost like you wearing a shirt, like it is the monkey that is on your back, right? So I think it's good, like I said, to always sit down and talk to somebody if these things are going on longer than seems. I don't want to use the word normal, but I'll use the word normal. Or if you know someone who it's been 2 years and they still in bed, they're not functioning, like they're not doing well. And let me say this, and I'm glad that I know this now. We feel that we cannot have peace and be happy in the midst of dealing with grief, especially when it comes to death. We have been taught for so long that when someone passes away, you have to be sad, you have to be depressed, you have to be all of these things. But who says that? Now, I do agree that there may be moments where you have sadness and you have these heavy emotions, but we get there and we stay there because we feel it's what's expected, or we feel that I can't possibly be seen out in public happy and living my life on the backside of this loss or on the backside of this grief, because that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. I have watched people, even on social media, and I know people personally who have experienced some heavy losses. Like they have walked through some stuff, but they chose joy. Joy is a choice. You can make a decision to not allow this grief, the depression, to be prolonged. It is a decision that you have to make, but you're going to have to be intentional about it. Don't allow others, because they stuck in the valley, don't allow others who find themselves in Lodabar to keep you there too. You can choose not to live there, but it is a choice that you have to make. So I just wanted to plug that in. So next, anxiety and fear of future losses. Again, it becomes a demonic doorway. So now people can become anxious about the future. They can become anxious that they may lose something else, whether that is a job. They can become anxious that they're going to lose another job. They can become anxious that they're going to lose another relationship. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you believe that these things are going to happen and you're now saying them out of your mouth, because life and death is in the power of the tongue, you shall have what you say, right? And so they become anxious and now fear. The Bible says that he has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind, right? He didn't give us a spirit of fear. So if you find yourself in anxiety or fear of the future, you have to ask yourself, where did that come from? Because it did not come from God. Third, they can have changes in their self-identity and in their worldview. Hey, Miss Teresa, thank you for hopping on. So, changes in self-identity and worldview. So they may begin to reevaluate their own personal beliefs. And so again, this may mean that the loss is so heavy, the grief is so overwhelming, they may question whether they believe in God. Because how can God take this away from me? If God is so good, if he's so just, if he's so loving, why would he do this? So a person that had a very solid and strong foundation with God, you may see them walk away from their faith, because they can't believe that the God that they serve would allow them to walk through this. They may reevaluate their own values, their own self-identity as a result of the loss. So let's talk about possible coping mechanisms. When we look at coping mechanisms, it's how you respond to pain, basically. It's how you respond to difficulty in your life. So coping mechanisms are either healthy or they're unhealthy. They good or they not good when it comes to coping. So a healthy coping mechanism would be seeking therapy, talking to loved ones, praying, right? Prayer is probably number one, but these are in no particular order. You need to pray. God is with you. The Bible says that God is near to the brokenhearted. So if your heart is broken, you have to believe that God is near you, even in that. It doesn't matter how you feel. Another saying that Dr. Ramsey says, and I always use, I'm gonna give him royalties for this one too. He says the feelings are real, but they're wrong. Your feelings will lie to you. Your feelings will lie to you. Your faith has nothing to do with your feelings. Sometimes, when it comes to what you are experiencing, you have to faith it. Like sometimes you have to convince yourself that what you are experiencing is not necessarily that. And what I mean by that, your feelings will lie to you and tell you that nobody cares. Your feelings will lie to you and tell you that God doesn't love you. And so in those moments, you have to silence the lies of the enemy and you got to pray. What does the Bible say? And I just gave you one. God is near the brokenhearted, right? And then another healthy copinism is engaging in self-care. Are you taking care of yourself? That's typically the first sign that you know someone is really dealing with some deep depression as it relates to grief and loss. Like they just stop taking care of themselves. Like they may not be taking a bath, they may not be eating, or they're overeating, or they've developed some very unhealthy patterns of behavior. So it is okay to take care of yourself and carving out time so that you can take care of you. And during that self-care, it gives you an opportunity to check in with you. How am I? Because sometimes people will ask you, well, how are you doing? And you honestly don't know because you don't know where you are in that because you haven't taken the time to check in with you. Sometimes it's okay to get off of social media, cut the phone off. No, I'm not coming to the hangout so that you can check in with you and see where you are in the process. So let's talk about some unhealthy coping skills, engaging in substance use. And again, in my work, in my study, I have encountered many individuals when you find them on substances, I ask questions. I think that's one of the things that has made me more well-rounded as a practitioner is I ask questions. You know, if someone is really dealing with substance use, like I'm not looking at the fruit on the tree. I want to know what is the root of it. Whenever I encounter the homeless, like I stop, like I'll get out and I'll go talk to them because I want to hear their story. And I'll ask them, how did you end up here? And if you take the time to talk to them, many of their pasts lead them back to grief. It leads them back to heartbreak. It leads to a loss. And so their way of dealing with their heart being broken or their soul being fragmented was they turned to a substance because, again, they wanted to numb the pain. And so it's not uncommon when you find somebody who is using substances of any kind that they didn't just wake up one day and decided, I am going to be somebody who is addicted to meth, or I'm going to be someone that's addicted to crack, or I'm going to be someone who is now selling my body. I just don't believe that they just woke up and decided that. I believe that they made one decision out of their pain, and that decision has been detrimental, and they have not been able to find their way back to themselves, right? Another one is isolating oneself from others. That is a coping strategy that sometimes people use. Number one, they don't want to have to be honest about where they are. Or two, they can be ashamed that they've allowed grief to get them to such a desolate place. So it's just easier to isolate. But isolation can be, again, dangerous because it gives the enemy greater access. Because what voices are you listening to when you're in that place of isolation? Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to, like I said, steal away for a time. Maybe you want to go fast and you want to pray. That's different. But I'm talking about you are isolating yourself and you don't have that connection with God. Another one is avoiding the reality of the loss, again, through denial or distraction. You don't want to talk about it. You're distracting yourself with busyness. Can I talk about that? What in the Holly Brock is that, right? when I have gone through difficult seasons in life, and I still do it if I want to be honest, I distract myself with busyness. I will get busy. I will work more, or I will go to the gym more, or I just get like, I'm just doing all the things. And I think on one hand, it can be good if I am busy doing what God is telling me to do. Like that can be a great motivator. But I think it can be detrimental if you are being busy to avoid dealing with your emotions. Because the thing about those feelings and those emotions, they don't just go away. You can bury them, sure. You burying something in the ground doesn't negate the reality that it still exists. It's still in the ground. You just buried it. So you have to ask yourself, in my busyness, am I being busy as a way to distract myself and avoid dealing with what I'm actually experiencing? And in most cases, when we become distracted or busy, that is typically the reason. So let's look at some of the spiritual effects of grief. So there's a crisis of faith or spiritual questioning. And I talked about that a little bit earlier when we questioned, how can God do this? If he's a God that loves me and he's just, why did he allow this to happen to me? There can be intense questioning of one's spiritual beliefs and faith, wondering why the loss occurred, seeking meaning in my suffering. And so we are a people that always seeks to understand. We want to know why something happened. And so if I have to suffer, in my mind, it needs to make sense as to why it happened. I need to understand, if I'm suffering, God, what is the purpose of this? And we may pray, we may cry out, we may ask all the questions, but God may not give you a reason. And that can be difficult when we don't have a reason as into our suffering. Hang tight 1 second. Let me let Gizmo out. All right, sorry about that. Had to let the dog out. And so if we are able to understand why something happens, we're able to process it. But not only as it relates to loss and grief, we typically struggle with things that we don't understand. And that can be true too when it comes to people in their relationship with God. Many people don't understand God. They don't understand the faith. And so we typically stay away from things that we don't understand. And so when people don't have a why to their suffering, it makes it more difficult for them to process it or come to terms with it. There can be a deepening of spiritual beliefs and their practices. So, the good thing about grief is that in certain situations, it may actually draw you closer to God because of the pain that you're feeling. And so, you're taking that to God. So, it may deepen your prayer. Or maybe God shows you through that grief or through that loss that it was actually Him, that He actually had purpose. For example, a loss that sometimes people really struggle with is you got let go of a job, or maybe your job downsized, whatever the case may be. And so, number one, you're questioning, well, why did this happen? But then, two, as you pray through that and you see that God moved you out of that job before the company completely folded, then in that circumstance, although it was a loss, because you have an understanding and you're able to see the why, it may deepen your relationship and your faith with God, because this will always be a testimony. God will use everything that we go through so that He gets the glory. Nothing in God is ever wasted. The Bible says that all things work together for your good. Good is not a feeling. Good does not mean that it feels good. Good means beneficial. So everything that you go through, even the things that hurt, the grief and the loss, all of it, all of the circumstances, all of the challenges, they work for your benefit. Many of us don't stick in the process long enough to see the benefit. We jump out, or we try to get out of the process, or we move too quickly and we're not able to fully see God bring this thing back full circle. There's also experiences of transcendence, and we have more spiritual growth. Grief can lead to moment, like I talked about, profound insight, more spiritual awakening, and a deeper connection with God. All right. And we are getting close to being done. All right. So let's look at grief and personal transformation. So, one of the terms that we use a lot in psychology is post traumatic growth, which basically means what did you learn after the fact, after the trauma? How did you grow as a result of it? Positive changes and personal growth that emerge from the struggle with loss and adversity, such as number one, you have increased resilience, which means that when these circumstances happen again, and they will, we all go through different moments in our life where we have loss and we have grief. But you're more resilient, which means you're able to bounce back more. Being more resilient makes you more like a rubber band where you're movable, you're moldable. It's like you bend, but you won't break because you're able to look back on this and say, well, if God brought me through this before, then He is a God that can do it again. And you're able to see your own strength in the midst of adversity. Many of us don't realize how strong we are until our strength is put under pressure. And we're not strong in our own might or in our own power, but we are strong in Him because the Bible says that when we are weak, that is when He is made strong, right? And so it is even in that we're able to see that we're able to take on more than maybe we even thought of. Or you have people that say, I just don't know how you went through that. Or they want to know what is your testimony because you walked through that. You went through the fire, but you didn't come out smelling like smoke. Right? People are always watching our lives. And sometimes we don't even realize how much of a testimony we are to others until they tell us how much our story or them watching us walk through something has blessed them. Again, prime example, when Kai went to live with his father, I did not realize how me walking through that blessed so many people, because the average mom wouldn't have. And did it happy all the time? No. But I was very transparent about where I was in the process. I was very transparent about how I felt. But again, them being able to see that we can do difficult things and allow God to get the glory can be encouraging and motivating for people. We can now have a new profound appreciation for life, but it also can improve our relationships. Like I said before, sometimes when we have a loss, especially as it relates to death, it can make us now have more appreciation of the relationships and things that we have in our life. It can change our personal values and priorities, reassessment of what is truly important in life. And again, we're talking about grief and loss, not just grief as it relates to death. Sometimes when things leave our lives, whether it's relationships, whether it's jobs, whether it's opportunities, we have a reassessment of what's truly important. Because when you lose something, I think you realize, number one, it was never important, or two, you place too much value on it. And this often leads to a more meaningful and purpose-driven existence. I believe his name is Rick Warren. He wrote the book Purpose-Driven Life. I still have a copy. That is an absolutely wonderful book that talks about purpose. But when we step back from situations and we're able to reevaluate them, our existence now becomes more driven regarding our purpose. Why are you here? Why are you created? And it sometimes makes us realize how much time we've wasted not being in purpose. We may develop deeper empathy and compassion for others because now we don't walk through something like, oh, this is what they feel like, right? So now that you have your own experience and your own testimony, you may now be empathetic and more compassionate towards others as they walk through. So you have an increased sensitivity to the sufferings of others and a stronger desire to help and support those in need. And again, you may find new meaning and purpose in life, finding new goals, new passions. Maybe you didn't have a reason to live before, but now this loss has ignited a fire under you, and you now have a new reason to live. And this can oftentimes be inspired by the memory and the legacy of the individual, especially if it was someone that passed away. So let's talk about the cultural variations in expressing and coping with grief. Different cultures have unique mourning rituals and expectations, such as specific mourning periods, expressions of emotions, and community involvement. And not even as it relates to culture, I think how people themselves deal with grief. You have some individuals, like if you're looking at death, when someone dies, they may have a really big funeral, with they pull out all of the stops. But then other families, they may cremate the people as they pass away, right? And so how they honor the dead. And when I say honor, I'm not talking about building a memorial, because that becomes more idealistic. Like now you're creating idols, but how do you honor them? Like how do you acknowledge their life and their legacy is what I mean by honor. And so also being aware. And then sometimes when you have, like maybe you have a coworker, I'll use that as an example for somebody who maybe has a different cultural practice. And if they're not Christian, like maybe they're Hindu. And so their cultural practice may be totally different. And so what that means is that you still are able to meet them where they are. But I think sometimes too, you have to be okay with maintaining your own boundaries, as it relates to how other people are doing things that may be outside of the box of your comfort, and it may be outside of the box of what you believe. You being empathetic and being compassionate does not mean that you now have to come into agreement and believe what they believe. It absolutely does not. So just keep in mind those cultural differences as it relates to mourning. But also when it comes to loss, when people deal with loss, depending on your upbringing, depending on where you are, sometimes people don't even talk about loss. And again, the grief that is associated with it. So sometimes that can be helpful for you to be able to even provide that language to someone who may have lost a job or lost, they didn't have an opportunity, and giving them the opportunity to be able to talk about the grief and what they're experiencing in those moments. It's important, no matter where you are, to have that social support. And what is the impact of that social support? The presence and quality of social support from family, friends, and community can significantly affect the grieving process and emotional healing. And then we know that community plays a role in collective mourning. We see that if there was a pillar in the community that maybe passed away, sometimes you even see that where there's a collective grieving. If there's a loss, like you see right now, like especially on the news, like all of this bad weather moving through, and maybe not even related to death, but people are losing their homes, they're losing their businesses, buildings. So collectively they're mourning the loss, but it can make it stronger and more impactful as they come together and they grieve those losses together as a community. And then sometimes you see that too played out if there is like a, like when you see when there's a mass shooting and there's a collective mourning and loss, they have public memorials, they have vigils. You may hear them, talk about support groups, but they also provide that shared space of mourning and some emotional support. So what about the media portrayal of grief and its influence? Media representation of grief can shape societal attitudes and expectations about how grief should be expected and managed. Again, like I talked about earlier, you can choose joy in the midst of grief. But again, when you watch a movie, you see everybody dressed in black, you see the very dark, ambiance of what the grief should look like. And that may not necessarily be true, right? You can choose joy in the midst of any grief or in the midst of loss. But even on social media, I think they strongly influence what the expectation is that relates to grief. And then now let's talk about healing and integration. The concept of healing in the soul. Healing involves reconciling the loss and finding a new sense of normalcy, Whenever you are experiencing grief of loss, the previous normal no longer exists, right? Especially if somebody has passed away. So what many people sometimes struggle with is that they try to relive what used to be. Well, that normal no longer exists anymore. And so you have to create a new normal in the midst of all of that. And again, we talked about that new normalcy is peace. It is a journey of integrating the loss into one's life and finding a way to honor the memories, maybe the memories of what was, but it could also be the memories of the individual if they actually are deceased. And there is a difference between honoring memories and now creating an idol out of that person's death. And I think sometimes, again, that prolongs the individual's grief. And I'm not saying this at all to be disrespectful or any manner or inconsiderate, but I just want you to think about it. You know, sometimes you'll go into an individual's house and they've created a whole shrine to someone who has passed away. And now it becomes an idol, right? Because they almost worship this place. And so you have to be careful. There is a place to honor the memories, but again, sometimes we get pulled over into creating an idol out of this individual, right? So just kind of be careful about some of those things. Let's look at some of the therapeutic approaches to grief counseling, again, sitting down with a professional to help navigate the emotional and psychological challenges that you may be experiencing with grief. Support groups can be very good, but also too sometimes support groups can prolong your grief because you're being somewhat re-traumatized by everybody else's grief. And it depends on the type of support group. So if you have a good support group and the leaders are definitely encouraging people to heal and move forward and not being stuck, then I think that can be helpful collectively. But if it's one of those support groups where everybody shows up week after week and they're still talking about where they're hurting and they're still talking about where they stuck, then that becomes contagious. And so it's like you go home and you do your work to feel better. You're praying, you're working through the healing, but then you go to support group and now you're contaminated with everybody else's grief again. And so it's just a cycle. So you have to also be kind of careful when it comes to support groups because they now can become a place where you just become enslaved and in bondage to everybody else's grief, right? I think art therapy can be really good if you find a good art therapist that helps you be able to draw what you're feeling. Like maybe you don't have a lot of words. Excuse me. Art therapy can be very good to help process and put pictures to what you're feeling. Writing therapy can be very good. I love writing. Journaling, you know, if the grief is related to the death of an individual, sometimes it can be therapeutic to write down how you feel, what you wish you could have said to that individual, just as a way to get it up and get it out. And so all of those can be very, very helpful when it comes to different therapeutic approaches to your grief. And then the last thing is being able to give yourself time and patience in the healing process. As I said earlier, there is no time frame that someone can set aside and say, by 6 months, you should feel better. Should you gradually be improving? Oh, absolutely. But there is no in 6 months, you know, you should be at this place in the grieving process, or in a year, you shouldn't hurt anymore. I don't think you ever stop feeling a little bit of pain as it relates to the death of the individual. It should get better. I think you should be able to cope with it better, right? Maybe you get to a place where you can talk about it without crying, right? Or the holidays no longer trigger depression. So there is a season where it gets better, but you can't put a timestamp on what that process looks like. But then too, being patient with yourself. Sometimes we can get so upset and impatient with our own selves because the process isn't moving as quickly as we think it should. Or we get upset with ourselves and feel that we maybe are not actually doing the work when we still find ourselves hurting, you know, a couple of months after, you know, something has happened. And then two, I think having or being able to hear other people's testimonies about how they were able to get through, how God showed up for them, how God comforted them. You know, sometimes those can be very motivational and very encouraging when it comes to being able to deal with grief. So no matter the reason for the grief, again, whether it's loss, it affects our soul. It affects every part of our being, our mind, our will, our emotions, our imaginations, our memories. But grief also is very spiritual. and that it can affect our relationship with God. It can affect how we see God. It can affect our spirit. Our spirit can be feeling very heavy. It can become a demonic or doorway if we're not careful in the way that we're grieving and how we're handling it. But grief also can be physical. You know, grief can affect our physical body. If you're anxious, it can affect your heart. You know, if you're carrying a lot of stress as it relates to the grief and loss, you know, it can just be very detrimental overall to your physiological well-being. And so it's just important that as you go through grief, as you are grieving, as you're dealing with loss, that you just give yourself space to heal, and that know that God is the God that sees you right where you are. He is with you. He is for you. There is nothing that he is not aware of that occurs in our life. Even though right now it may feel like he's not there, he is. God is near to the brokenhearted. Sometimes we just have to be willing to be honest with ourselves, but then to being honest with him, even though he already knows where you are in this grieving process and how you feel. All right. Well, that's all I got. I did this in 90 minutes. Go me. I hope that this teaching was helpful. This was about grief and the effects on the soul. As always, if you catch this on the replay, please let me know you caught this on the replay. If you have questions about anything, feel free to drop them when you watch this video. I do get the comments, or you can inbox me if you don't want to message me here, or if you have a question about anything else, inner healing, deliverance, all things mental health. I don't know everything, but what I know, I know. So definitely reach out to me. I will be doing this more. But again, I just wanted to come on for Mental Health Awareness Month and talk about the soul. Well, thank you all for joining me. My name is Holly Brock. You guys enjoy your evening, and check out my website. Go subscribe. I send out newsletters and I let you guys know when I'm teaching. So yeah, it's a lot of cool stuff on my website. Go check out my website. If you have not subscribed to my YouTube, please do so. As people subscribe, it kind of helps with the algorithm. I want to try to get these videos out to more people. Share this on your page. Hey, do all the things. Yeah. But anyway, enjoy the rest of your day. I love you all, and be absolute.